In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where protocol rules every breath and tradition weighs heavier than gold, there are moments that shake the very foundations of centuries-old customs. This is the story of one such moment, when a young prince's simple gesture silenced an entire room and left even the king himself searching for words. What happened that day would challenge everything the royal family thought they knew about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of leadership. It was a moment that reminded everyone present that sometimes the most powerful acts come not from those who wear crowns, but from those who choose to set them aside. This is the true story of Prince Louis and the day he showed the world what it really means to be royal. The morning of November 15th started like any other day at Buckingham Palace. The ancient stone walls echoed with the familiar sounds of preparation as staff members moved through their carefully choreographed routines. Prince Louis Arthur Charles, the youngest child of the Prince and Princess of Wales, sat at the breakfast table in the family quarters, his small hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk. At just 5 years old, Louis had already shown signs of the spirited personality that would soon become legendary within palace walls. His bright blue eyes sparkled with mischief as he watched his older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, discuss their upcoming school presentations. The family dining room, though grand by most standards, felt intimate in the early morning light filtering through tall windows. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, smoothed Louis's unruly hair as she reviewed the day's schedule with William. Today was particularly important because they would be hosting a special reception for families affected by the recent flooding in northern England. It was the kind of event that required careful planning and even more careful execution, as representatives from various charities, government officials, and, most importantly, the affected families themselves would be present. Louis had been included in the guest list, something that had sparked considerable debate among palace staff. At his young age, most royal events were considered too formal or potentially overwhelming. However, Catherine had insisted that her children understand their roles not just as royals, but as people with the power to make a difference in others' lives. The reception was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m. in the Blue Drawing Room, one of the palace's most elegant spaces. The room, with its silk-covered walls and priceless artwork, had hosted countless dignitaries throughout history. Today, however, it would welcome families who had lost everything when the River Trent burst its banks 3 weeks earlier. As the morning progressed, Louis found himself increasingly curious about the visitors they would be meeting. He had heard his parents discussing the flooding during their private conversations, and, while he didn't fully understand the complexity of natural disasters, he sensed the sadness in their voices when they spoke about it. Staff members bustled through the palace, ensuring every detail was perfect. The catering team prepared a selection of traditional British fare alongside more casual options that children might enjoy. Security personnel reviewed protocols while maintaining the balance between protection and accessibility that such events required. Palace Protocol Officer Margaret Thornfield had worked at Buckingham Palace for over 20 years, and she took particular pride in ensuring that every royal event ran smoothly. She had prepared extensive briefing notes for the family, outlining who would be attending, appropriate conversation topics, and the planned schedule for the afternoon. Among the guests would be the Morrison family from Nottingham. Sarah Morrison, a single mother of 2, had watched helplessly as floodwater destroyed her small flat, taking with it not just furniture and belongings, but irreplaceable family photographs and her children's treasured possessions. Her 7-year-old daughter Emma and 4-year-old son Jack had been particularly affected by the loss of their toys and books. The Patel family from Derby had also accepted the invitation. Raj and Priya Patel had run a small corner shop that served their community for 15 years. The flooding had destroyed their inventory and damaged the building so severely that they faced the possibility of never reopening. Their teenage children, Arjun and Mira, had been helping their parents navigate insurance claims while trying to maintain their studies. There was also elderly Mr. Albert Henshaw, a 78-year-old widower whose ground floor flat had been completely flooded. He had lived in the same home for 40 years, and many of the items he lost held deep sentimental value, including letters from his late wife and photographs from his military service. As lunchtime approached, Louis began to show signs of the nervous energy that often preceded important events. He asked his mother repeated questions about who they would be meeting and what they would talk about. Catherine patiently explained that they would be meeting people who had experienced difficult times and that their job was simply to listen and show that they cared. The concept of listening seemed particularly important to Louis, though he wasn't entirely sure why adults made such a big deal about it. In his experience, most grown-ups were much better at talking than listening, especially when they were being formal and important. By 1 o'clock, the Blue Drawing Room had been transformed into a welcoming space that balanced royal grandeur with accessibility. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, and comfortable seating areas had been arranged to encourage conversation. Staff members made final adjustments to the refreshment tables and ensured that everything met the exacting standards expected for a royal reception. The family gathered in Catherine's private sitting room for a final briefing. William reviewed the guest list one more time, while Catherine helped Charlotte adjust her dress and ensured that George had remembered his pocket square. Louis, dressed in his formal navy suit with short trousers, fidgeted with his tie until his father gently helped him straighten it. Margaret Thornfield appeared at the door precisely at 1:30 to escort the family to the blue drawing room. As they walked through the corridors, Louis marveled at how different the palace felt when it was preparing to welcome visitors. The usual quiet dignity was replaced by an air of anticipation and purpose. The first guests had already begun to arrive, and Louis could see through the doorway that several families were standing somewhat awkwardly near the entrance, clearly overwhelmed by their surroundings. He noticed a little girl about his own age clinging to her mother's hand, her eyes wide as she took in the ornate ceiling and gilded furniture. Palace staff members moved gracefully through the room, offering refreshments and gentle conversation designed to help guests feel more comfortable. The contrast between the formal setting and the very personal nature of the event created a unique atmosphere that challenged traditional royal protocol. As the family took their positions near the entrance to greet their guests, Louis felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach. He had attended many royal events before, but something about today felt different. Perhaps it was the way his parents had spoken about these visitors, or maybe it was simply that he was getting old enough to understand that not everyone lived in palaces. The clock in the corridor chimed twice, signaling that the reception would officially begin. William straightened his shoulders, Catherine smoothed her skirt one final time, and the children took their places. Outside, the last of the invited families were making their way through the palace gates, about to experience something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. None of them, including the royal family themselves, had any idea that this carefully planned afternoon would soon take an unexpected turn that would challenge everything they thought they knew about protocol, compassion, and what it truly meant to serve others. The stage was set for a moment that would resonate far beyond the palace walls, touching hearts and changing perspectives in ways no one could have anticipated. The doors opened, and the first guest stepped into the blue drawing room, beginning what would become one of the most memorable and transformative events in recent royal history. The reception began exactly as protocol dictated. William and Catherine moved gracefully from group to group, their years of training evident in every gesture and word. They possessed the remarkable ability to make each person feel as though they were the most important guest in the room, asking thoughtful questions and listening intently to the responses. Louis followed at what palace staff considered an appropriate distance, observing the interactions with growing fascination. He watched as his father knelt down to speak with young Emma Morrison, who had been hiding behind her mother's skirt since arriving. William's genuine smile and gentle questions gradually coaxed the little girl out of her shell, and soon she was telling him about her favorite stuffed elephant that had been lost in the flood. The sight of Emma's tears as she described her missing toy affected Louis more than he had expected. He had never experienced loss in the way these families had, and the concept of losing something precious seemed almost impossible to comprehend. His own room at the palace was filled with toys and books, many of which he had forgotten about or rarely touched. Catherine engaged in deep conversation with Sarah Morrison about the challenges of rebuilding their lives. The practical details were overwhelming: finding temporary housing, replacing essential items, dealing with insurance companies that moved slower than the families needed. Sarah spoke with quiet dignity about her determination to create a stable home for her children despite the setbacks. Meanwhile, George and Charlotte had been paired with the teenage members of the Patel family. They discussed school subjects and shared stories about their interests, creating connections that bridged the gap between their vastly different experiences. Arjun Patel was particularly impressed by George's knowledge of football statistics, while Charlotte and Mira discovered a mutual love of art and drawing. As the afternoon progressed, Louis found himself drawn to Mr. Albert Henshaw, who sat slightly apart from the other guests in a comfortable armchair near the window. The elderly gentleman had accepted a cup of tea but seemed content to observe the interactions around him rather than actively participate in conversations. Louis approached Mr. Henshaw with the directness that only children possess. He climbed onto a nearby ottoman and studied the man's kind face, noting the deep lines around his eyes and the careful way he held his teacup. "Are you sad?" Louis asked, his young voice cutting through the gentle murmur of adult conversation. Mr. Henshaw looked down at the small prince with surprise and something approaching delight. In a room full of carefully chosen words and diplomatic phrases, the child's honesty was refreshing. Sometimes I am sad, yes, Mr. Henshaw replied thoughtfully. But, today, sitting here with you, I feel grateful. Louis considered this response with the seriousness that children bring to important conversations. He had noticed that adults often said they were fine when they clearly were not, but something about Mr. Henshaw's answer felt different, more honest. What made you sad? Louis persisted, seemingly unaware that such direct questions often made adults uncomfortable. Mr. Henshaw set down his teacup and gave Louis his full attention. The flood took away some things that were very special to me. Pictures of my wife, who died 2 years ago. Letters she wrote to me when we were young. Things that can't be replaced. The weight of this revelation settled over Louis like a heavy blanket. He understood death, having attended great-grandmother's funeral the previous year. But, the idea that memories could be lost along with a person seemed unbearably sad. Across the room, Catherine noticed the intense conversation between her youngest son and Mr. Henshaw. She started to move toward them, concerned that Louis might be overwhelming their guest with inappropriate questions. But, something in the quality of their interaction made her pause and observe instead. Louis slipped down from the ottoman and disappeared from the reception room so quickly that most guests didn't notice his absence. Palace staff, trained to keep track of royal family members at all times, began to look concerned. However, Margaret Thornfield had seen Louis leave and discreetly followed at a distance to ensure his safety. Louis moved through the palace corridors with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life within these walls. He knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to do. His small feet made almost no sound on the plush carpeting as he navigated toward the family quarters. In his bedroom, Louis went directly to a special wooden chest that sat beneath the window. This chest contained his most treasured possessions, not the expensive toys that filled his shelves, but the simple items that held personal meaning. There was a smooth stone he had found during a beach walk with his grandfather, a drawing Charlotte had made for his 4th birthday, and a small stuffed rabbit that had been his constant companion since infancy. Louis carefully selected the rabbit, holding it close to his chest as he considered what he was about to do. The rabbit had been with him through countless nights, providing comfort during thunderstorms and unfamiliar beds during royal tours. Its fur was worn soft from years of cuddles, and one ear was slightly shorter than the other from a long-ago accident that had required emergency surgery by Catherine. Margaret Thornfield watched from the doorway as Louis clutched the rabbit tightly, clearly wrestling with some internal decision. She recognized the signs of a child about to do something significant and wondered whether she should intervene or allow events to unfold naturally. The journey back to the blue drawing room seemed longer than the trip away from it. Louis walked slowly, his mind working through thoughts and feelings that were too complex for his young vocabulary to express. He understood that giving away his beloved rabbit would not bring back Mr. Henshaw's lost photographs or letters. But something deep inside him insisted that offering comfort was more important than keeping comfort for himself. When Louis re-entered the reception room, he was immediately noticed by several guests and family members. The small rabbit in his arms drew curious glances, particularly since it clearly did not match the formal atmosphere of the event. Palace protocol did not typically include children's toys at official receptions. Louis walked directly back to Mr. Henshaw, who had been joined by William and was discussing the challenges of rebuilding communities after natural disasters. The conversation paused as the small prince approached with obvious determination. Without hesitation or explanation, Louis held out the rabbit to Mr. Henshaw. The gesture was so unexpected and genuine that it seemed to stop time itself. The elderly gentleman looked down at the offered toy with confusion and growing emotion. "This is for you," Louis said simply. "Because you lost your special things, and everyone should have something special." The room had indeed begun to quiet as people noticed what was happening. Conversation slowed and eventually stopped as guests and staff alike focused on the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. Even King Charles, who had arrived partway through the reception, stood perfectly still as he witnessed his grandson's spontaneous act of generosity. Mr. Henshaw's eyes filled with tears as he gently accepted the rabbit. His hands shook slightly as he held the worn toy, understanding instinctively that this was not just any stuffed animal but something deeply precious to the child who was giving it away. The silence that followed was not empty but full of emotion, recognition, and the profound impact of witnessing pure compassion in action. In a world where royal gestures were typically planned, rehearsed, and calculated for maximum effect, Louis had done something completely authentic and unrehearsed. William stood frozen, his diplomatic training warring with his parental pride. Catherine's hand moved to her heart as she watched her youngest son demonstrate a level of empathy that could not be taught or coached. Even the palace staff, accustomed to remarkable moments in royal history, recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The moment stretched on, preserved in the memories of everyone present, as they collectively realized that sometimes the most powerful acts of leadership come not from grand speeches or formal ceremonies, but from the simple recognition of another person's pain and the willingness to do something about it. King Charles was the first to break the profound silence that had settled over the blue drawing room. His voice, when it came, was softer than anyone had ever heard it in an official setting. He approached his grandson and Mr. Henshaw with careful steps, as though he too understood that he was witnessing something that should not be disturbed with unnecessary haste. "Louis," the king said gently, kneeling down to his grandson's eye level, "that was a very special thing you just did." Louis looked up at his grandfather with the matter-of-fact expression that children wear when they have done something that seems obvious to them, even if it appears extraordinary to adults. "He needed something special," Louis explained simply. "And I have lots of special things." Mr. Henshaw clutched the rabbit against his chest, his emotions clearly overwhelming him. The elderly man had experienced tremendous loss in recent months, first his wife, then his home and possessions, and now he was face to face with a level of kindness that seemed to restore something he thought had been lost forever. "Your Majesty," Mr. Henshaw managed to say, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you enough. This young man has given me more than he could possibly understand." The king nodded slowly, his own eyes glistening as he observed the interaction. In his decades of royal service, he had participated in countless charitable events and witnessed numerous acts of kindness. But there was something about his grandson's spontaneous generosity that cut through all the ceremony and protocol to reach something fundamentally human. Catherine approached the group, her maternal instincts warring with her understanding of royal protocol. She wanted to wrap Louis in her arms and tell him how proud she was, but she also recognized that this moment belonged to him and Mr. Henshaw. Her role was to bear witness, not to interfere. Other guests in the room had begun to move closer, drawn by the emotional intensity of the scene. The Morrison family stood together, with young Emma holding her mother's hand and watching Louis with wide eyes. She seemed to understand that something important was happening, even if she could not fully grasp its significance. Sarah Morrison found herself thinking about her own children and wondering if she would have the courage to give away a beloved toy to comfort a stranger. The level of empathy required for such an act seemed remarkable in someone so young, and it made her reflect on the values she was trying to instill in Emma and Jack. The Patel family exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would become a treasured memory. Raj Patel, who had been feeling overwhelmed by the challenges of rebuilding his business and supporting his family, found himself inspired by the young prince's example. If a 5-year-old could show such generosity in the face of someone else's need, surely he could find the strength to persevere through his own difficulties. Arjun and Meera Patel stood slightly behind their parents, both teenagers old enough to understand the significance of what they had just witnessed. Meera pulled out her phone instinctively, then stopped herself, realizing that some moments were too sacred to document. This was a memory that belonged in hearts, not on social media. Palace staff members found themselves in the unusual position of not knowing exactly what to do. Margaret Thornfield, despite her years of experience managing royal events, had never encountered a situation quite like this one. Protocol manuals did not include guidance for moments of spontaneous emotional generosity, particularly when they involved very young royals. The catering staff, who had been circulating with refreshments throughout the afternoon, stood still with their trays, unwilling to interrupt the profound moment unfolding before them. Even the security personnel, trained to remain alert and vigilant at all times, found themselves moved by the scene. William finally approached the group, placing a gentle hand on Louis's shoulder. As a father, he was bursting with pride at his son's compassion. As a future king, he recognized that Louis had just demonstrated the kind of authentic leadership that could not be taught in any classroom or training program. "Mr. Henshaw," William said formally, "my son has excellent taste in special friends. I hope you'll take good care of each other." The elderly gentleman looked up at the Prince of Wales with gratitude and something approaching wonder. "Sir, I promise you that this rabbit will be treasured for the rest of my days. And I will make sure that everyone who enters my home knows the story of the young prince who taught an old man about kindness." Louis seemed satisfied with this arrangement, nodding seriously as though they had just concluded an important business transaction. In his 5-year-old mind, the matter was settled. Mr. Henshaw needed something special, Lewis had provided something special, and now they could all move on to other important matters, like whether there might be cake. But the adults in the room understood that nothing would simply move on from this moment. They had witnessed something that would reshape their understanding of what it meant to serve others and what true leadership looked like. The carefully planned reception had become something far more meaningful than anyone could have anticipated. Charlotte and George approached their younger brother with expressions of awe and pride. They had always known Lewis was special, but seeing him through the eyes of these guests and their grandfather helped them understand their brother in a new way. Charlotte reached out and took Lewis's hand, squeezing it gently in a gesture of solidarity and support. "That was brilliant," George whispered to Lewis, using the understated praise that characterized his personality. Coming from his older brother, whom Lewis idolized, this simple statement meant more than any formal recognition could have provided. Gradually, the guests began to move around the room again, but the energy had completely changed. Conversations that had started as polite exchanges between strangers had deepened into genuine connections between people who had shared something profound together. The artificial barriers between royalty and subjects had dissolved, replaced by a sense of common humanity that transcended titles and positions. Emma Morrison, inspired by Lewis's example, approached her mother with a quiet request. She wanted to give something to the little prince who had been so kind to Mr. Henshaw. After searching through her small bag, she produced a slightly crumpled drawing she had made that morning, a picture of her family standing in front of a rainbow. With her mother's encouragement, Emma approached Lewis and shyly offered her drawing. "I made this for you," she said softly, "because you were nice." Lewis accepted the drawing with the same seriousness he had shown when giving away his rabbit. He studied the colorful figures and bright rainbow with genuine appreciation, recognizing the gift for what it truly was, a sharing of something precious from one child to another. This second exchange of gifts seemed to open floodgates of generosity throughout the room. Not physical gifts, necessarily, but offerings of stories, shared experiences, and genuine human connection. The formal reception had transformed into something more like a family gathering, where people felt comfortable sharing their authentic selves rather than their carefully constructed public personas. King Charles watched these interactions with growing amazement. He had spent his entire life learning how to connect with people across social and economic divides, studying the art of making others feel valued and heard. Yet his 5-year-old grandson had accomplished more in a few minutes than most trained diplomats could achieve in hours of careful conversation. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the blue drawing room, casting golden light across the assembled group. Palace staff began to prepare for the formal conclusion of the reception, but everyone in the room seemed reluctant to end what had become an extraordinary experience of human connection and shared understanding. As the reception began to wind down, the impact of Lewis's simple act continued to ripple through the room in ways that no one could have predicted. What had started as a formal charitable event had transformed into something far more meaningful and lasting. Mr. Henshaw sat in his armchair by the window, still holding Lewis's rabbit, when young Emma Morrison approached him with surprising confidence. The little girl had been watching the elderly gentleman throughout the afternoon and had made a decision that surprised even her mother. "Can I sit with you?" Emma asked, pointing to the empty chair beside Mr. Henshaw. "Of course, my dear," he replied, his voice still carrying the emotion from his earlier exchange with Lewis. Emma climbed into the chair and arranged her small dress carefully before speaking. "My mummy says you lost pictures of your wife." "I lost my elephant, but I still remember him." "Do you remember your wife even without the pictures?" The question, delivered with the innocent directness that only children possess, touched Mr. Henshaw more deeply than all the official condolences he had received. "Yes," he said softly, "I remember her very well. Her smile, her laugh, the way she made the best tea in all of England." Emma nodded seriously. "Then, she's not really lost, is she? Not like my elephant. She's still in your heart." This observation, coming from a 7-year-old who had herself experienced loss, struck Mr. Henshaw as profoundly wise. He found himself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks, realizing that this child had given him a gift even more precious than the comfort of Lewis's rabbit. Across the room, the Patel family had gathered around a table where George was showing Arjun and Mira some of the historical artifacts displayed in the blue drawing room. Their conversation had evolved from polite small talk into an animated discussion about history, resilience, and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. "When our shop flooded," Raj Patel told George, "we thought we had lost everything. But seeing how your brother gave away something precious to help someone else, it makes me realize that what we've built in our community, the relationships, the trust, the way people look out for each other, that can't be washed away." Priya Patel nodded in agreement, adding, "We've been so focused on what we lost that we forgot to appreciate what remains. Today has reminded us that kindness and generosity can rebuild more than any insurance payment." William and Catherine moved through the room, their official duties as hosts gradually giving way to more personal connections with their guests. They found themselves engaged in conversations that went far beyond the usual polite exchanges typical of royal receptions. Catherine sat with Sarah Morrison, discussing not just the challenges of single parenthood after a disaster, but sharing genuine advice about raising children with empathy and resilience. Sarah was surprised to discover that despite their vastly different circumstances, she and the Princess of Wales faced many similar struggles in helping their children navigate difficult emotions and unexpected challenges. "How do you teach them to care about others without losing themselves?" Sarah asked, referencing the conversation she had witnessed between Louis and Mr. Henshaw. Catherine considered the question carefully before responding. "I think today showed us that children often understand generosity instinctively. Our job is not to teach them to care, but to protect that natural compassion as they grow older, and the world tries to convince them to be more cautious or self-interested." This exchange sparked a deeper conversation about parenting philosophies and the challenge of raising children who were both strong enough to protect themselves and open enough to help others. It was the kind of meaningful dialogue that rarely occurred at formal events, where conversations typically remain safely superficial. King Charles found himself in the unusual position of learning from his grandson's example while surrounded by people who had every reason to feel bitter or defeated by their circumstances. Instead, he was witnessing resilience, grace, and an inspiring willingness to support one another through difficult times. He approached Louis, who was now sitting on the floor examining Emma's drawing with serious concentration. "Louis," the king said, settling into a nearby chair, "do you understand what happened here today?" Louis looked up at his grandfather with the earnest expression he wore when trying to work through complex ideas. "I think so." Mr. Henshaw was sad because his special things got washed away. "So I gave him one of my special things. Now he has something special again." The simplicity of this explanation struck the king as remarkably profound. In a few sentences, his grandson had captured the essence of service and compassion that took most people decades to understand, if they ever understood it at all. "And how do you feel about giving away your rabbit?" the king asked gently. Louis considered this question with typical 5-year-old seriousness. "A little sad," he admitted honestly. "But also happy because Mr. Henshaw smiled. And Mummy always says that making people smile is more important than keeping things for yourself." Catherine, overhearing this conversation, felt her heart swell with a mixture of pride and recognition. She had indeed emphasized the importance of generosity and kindness in her children's upbringing, but seeing those values manifest so naturally and genuinely exceeded her highest hopes. Margaret Thornfield, who had been observing the afternoon's events with professional interest and personal amazement, began to understand that what she was witnessing would require a complete rewriting of how such events were documented and remembered. This was not just a successful charitable reception, it was a moment that would influence how the royal family approached their service to others for years to come. The palace staff, from the most senior advisors to the newest housekeeping assistants, found themselves discussing the afternoon's events with unusual animation. They had all seen their share of royal gestures and charitable activities, but something about Louis's spontaneous generosity and its effect on everyone present felt different and significant. As the formal time for the reception to end approached, no one seemed eager to leave. The guests lingered over their conversations, clearly reluctant to return to the challenges and uncertainties waiting for them outside the palace walls. The royal family members showed no signs of the polite fatigue that typically marked the conclusion of such events. Instead, there was a palpable sense that something important had been shared and created together. The barriers between royal hosts and grateful guests had dissolved into genuine human connections that transcended social positions and economic circumstances. Louis, seemingly unaware of the profound impact his actions had created, was now engaged in showing Mira Patel how to make a paper airplane using a piece of palace stationery. Their collaboration was producing impressive results, and soon several other children and adults had joined their impromptu engineering project. The sight of a young prince and the teenage daughter of flood victims working together on paper airplanes while surrounded by priceless art and historical artifacts seemed to perfectly encapsulate the spirit of the entire afternoon. Formal boundaries had given way to authentic human connection, and protocol had been replaced by genuine care and interest in one another. King Charles watched these interactions with growing understanding of what true leadership could look like. His grandson had not made speeches or grand gestures. He had simply seen someone in pain and responded with the most precious thing he could offer. The result had been a transformation of the entire gathering and a reminder to everyone present about what really mattered in life. As the golden afternoon light began to fade, everyone in the blue drawing room understood that they had experienced something extraordinary together, something that would influence how they thought about kindness, generosity, and service for the rest of their lives. The weeks following the reception brought changes that none of the participants could have anticipated. The story of Prince Louis's gift to Mr. Henshaw had spread far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace, not through official channels or press releases, but through the heartfelt sharing of those who had witnessed it firsthand. Mr. Albert Henshaw returned to his temporary housing with more than just a stuffed rabbit. He carried with him a renewed sense of hope and a story that he felt compelled to share. The elderly gentleman, who had been struggling with depression following the loss of his home and memories, found new purpose in telling others about the young prince who had shown him that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. Within days of the reception, Mr. Henshaw had contacted the local volunteer center where he had been receiving assistance. Instead of continuing to accept help, he asked how he could contribute to the recovery efforts. Despite his own losses and limited resources, he began spending his days at the emergency shelter, comforting other flood victims and sharing his story of unexpected kindness. The impact was immediate and profound. Other survivors, many of whom had been struggling with despair and hopelessness, found inspiration in Mr. Henshaw's transformation. The story of the young prince who had given away his treasured rabbit became a symbol of resilience and the power of human compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. Emma Morrison returned home to her temporary housing with a new understanding of what it meant to be kind. Her mother, Sarah, noticed immediate changes in her daughter's behavior. Emma began sharing her toys more freely with her younger brother Jack, and she started asking questions about how they could help other families affected by the flooding. Sarah found herself reflecting on the conversation she had shared with Catherine about raising children with empathy. Inspired by the Princess of Wales's insights and her daughter's example, she began volunteering at a local children's center, helping other single parents navigate the challenges of rebuilding their lives after disaster. The Morrison family's involvement in community recovery efforts led to connections with other families facing similar challenges. What started as individual struggles became shared efforts to support one another through difficult times. Emma's innocent questions about helping others had sparked a network of mutual aid that strengthened the entire community. At the Patel family's damaged shop, remarkable things began to happen. Word of their attendance at the royal reception and the impact it had on their perspective spread through their neighborhood. Customers who had shopped there for years but had never really connected with the family began stopping by to offer help with the restoration. Raj and Priya discovered that their shop had been more than just a business to their community, it had been a gathering place and a symbol of stability. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before the flood began working together to help rebuild the shop, creating connections that transformed the entire street into a more cohesive and supportive community. Arjun and Meera Patel found themselves taking on leadership roles in organizing youth volunteer efforts. Their experience at the palace had shown them that young people could make meaningful contributions to solving community problems. They established a program that connected teenage volunteers with elderly flood victims who needed help with practical tasks and emotional support. Back at Buckingham Palace, the impact of that afternoon continued to resonate throughout the royal household. King Charles had been profoundly affected by witnessing his grandson's spontaneous generosity, and it influenced his approach to future charitable engagements. He began incorporating more opportunities for unscripted interactions into official events, recognizing that authentic moments of connection often achieved more than carefully planned presentations. Catherine and William found themselves re-evaluating their approach to raising their children with an understanding of their future roles. While they had always emphasized the importance of service and compassion, Louis's example had shown them that their children already possessed deep wells of empathy that could be trusted and encouraged rather than controlled and directed. The palace staff, particularly Margaret Thornfield, began advocating for more flexible approaches to royal protocol. They had witnessed firsthand how allowing space for authentic human moments could create far more meaningful and impactful experiences than rigid adherence to traditional procedures. Louis himself seemed largely unaware of the far-reaching effects of his simple act of kindness. He missed his rabbit for several nights, but Catherine had quietly arranged for a new stuffed animal to help ease the transition. When Lewis asked if Mr. Henshaw was taking good care of his rabbit, Catherine was able to share some of the updates they had received about the elderly gentleman's renewed involvement in helping others. The story had also reached the flood-affected communities in ways that surprised everyone involved. Mr. Henshaw's example of turning personal loss into service for others inspired dozens of other survivors to shift from focusing solely on their own recovery to helping their neighbors rebuild. Local churches, community centers, and volunteer organizations reported unprecedented levels of participation from flood survivors who wanted to give back to their communities. The narrative had changed from one of victimhood and despair to one of resilience and mutual support. 3 months after the reception, Catherine received a letter that would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was from a teacher at a primary school in one of the affected areas, describing how her students had been inspired by the story of Prince Louis's gift to organize their own kindness campaign. The children had decided to create comfort packages for other young flood victims, including drawings, small toys, and handwritten notes of encouragement. What started as a single classroom project had spread throughout the school and, eventually, involved the entire district. Hundreds of children who had never experienced anything like the flooding themselves were learning about empathy and service through the example set by a 5-year-old prince. The teacher's letter described how the project had transformed her students' understanding of their ability to make a difference in the world. Children who had previously seemed indifferent to others' struggles were now actively looking for ways to help and support their classmates and community members. When Catherine shared this letter with Lewis, he listened with the serious attention he gave to all important matters. His response was characteristically simple and direct: "That's good. Everyone should have special things, and everyone should help." This straightforward philosophy, coming from a child who had demonstrated its power through his own actions, seemed to capture something essential about human nature and our capacity for compassion. The letter and countless similar stories confirmed that Lewis's moment of generosity had created ripple effects far beyond anything the royal family had ever imagined possible. As the first anniversary of the flooding approached, the communities that had been devastated by the disaster organized a celebration of recovery and resilience. Mr. Henshaw was invited to be a featured speaker, sharing his story of how unexpected kindness from a young prince had helped him transform loss into purpose. At the celebration, he stood before hundreds of survivors, volunteers, and community leaders, still holding the worn rabbit that had become a symbol of hope for the entire region. His speech was simple and heartfelt, focusing not on the royal family or the palace setting, but on the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change through small acts of compassion. The event concluded with children from across the affected communities presenting drawings and letters to be delivered to Prince Louis, thanking him for showing them that age did not matter when it came to making a difference in the world. The artwork created a colorful display that captured the joy and resilience that had emerged from a time of great difficulty. Back at Buckingham Palace, as Louis helped his parents look through the hundreds of drawings and letters he had received, he seemed most impressed by the variety of artistic styles and the creativity of the messages. His parents watched as their youngest son absorbed the evidence of his impact on so many lives, learning valuable lessons about the far-reaching effects of kindness and the responsibility that comes with the privilege of being able to help others. That evening, as Catherine tucked Louis into bed, she found him carefully arranging some of the drawings on his bedside table where he could see them when he woke up. His new stuffed animal, a bear that had been a gift from Mr. Henshaw, sat beside the pictures, creating a small shrine to the power of generosity and human connection. The room went silent that night, not from shock or surprise, but from the peaceful quiet of a child who had learned that the most important things in life could not be kept but only given away. In giving away his treasured rabbit, Louis had received something far more valuable in return: the knowledge that he had the power to heal hearts and change lives, one small act of kindness at a time. The story of that November afternoon would become part of royal family lore, passed down through generations as an example of what true service looked like. But, more importantly, it would continue to inspire ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances to choose compassion over comfort, generosity over self-interest, and connection over isolation. In the end, the room had gone silent not because of what a prince had given up, but because of what humanity had gained through his example. And, in that silence, everyone present had heard the most important lesson of all: that the power to change the world exists in every heart willing to share its treasure with those in need.